Over the next 3 volumes, we'll cover everything that goes into putting 3D into live action, which is half of all visual effects. And then on the 2 following volumes, we'll cover shooting green screen and making it fit into 3D, which is pretty much the other half of visual effects. Right now, we'll continue laying down some basics by first talking about compositing. Things like creating mats, keying, garbage matting, and tracking. Almost all of you already know these things. But the thing is that people often go blank as soon as they're on the set and start making mistakes. So we're going to be very basic about it and create some clear, simple rules you can follow. Here, one at the upper left, one in the bottom right, and another one here. Next, we'll color correct it into day for night. Replace the sky, add a moon, give it a hazy glow, throw in some birds to get a sense of scale, and paint in some fog through the valley. Next, let's put in a couple of fires. Let's paint in some smoke. And finally, let's put a tree in the foreground. That's a pretty typical composite. Compositing is very easy to understand, but it's important to really know how it works, because almost everything we shoot will end up there at some point. It's very common for people to think of compositing as a sort of magic box that can fix any problem, but that attitude can and will backfire in post. If we wanted to, for example, put a 3D element into this shot, we'd be in a lot of trouble, and the compositors would have to pull out their hair for days. We need to know exactly why that is. If you've ever used Photoshop, you already know compositing. One of the most typical things you do is simply bring in some elements. Find a way to extract a matte so the computer knows where the edges are, and then stack things on top of each other. Some blockbuster shots can have literally hundreds of elements that are shot or animated separately and brought together in compositing. Other composites are just a background and a foreground. So let's look at some typical things you might do to retouch a still image in Photoshop. If we wanted to, for example, replace the sky in this picture, we would use the Color Range tool to select all the parts with blue color. Delete the sky, and then we'd put in a new sky where the old one was. Or if something was shot on a green screen, we'd make a mask from all the green color and use that to replace the background. Or to color correct this car, we would again use the Color Range tool to get a mask that selects the car. Here's the mask. And with this selection, we can adjust the hue or whatever. In all these examples, we depended on being able to make a mask or a matte or an alpha channel of the area we wanted to work on. And that's very typical because you really can't do anything without a matte. The type of matte we just did is called a keyer because we get a matte from a certain color. But you can't just key anything to get a matte. There has to be a clear difference in the colors, so if we tried to key the background here to isolate the castle, we'd end up selecting almost everything else, which you can't use for anything. So very often, mattes have to be painted by hand using Photoshop's lasso tool. That's done by tracing the outline of the castle, which is not really that fun, but it's sometimes the only way to get a matte. After we've painted the matte, we can lift the castle out, or whatever we want to do, and for example, drop it into another picture. This doesn't look that great, but you get the point. And in order to put anything behind anything, you also need a matte. If we want to put these 3D spaceships into the background of the castle picture, obviously it doesn't work to just put them on top because they're supposed to go behind. But if we trace the edges of the foreground and use that to cancel out the mask on the spaceships, they now seem to go behind as they should. But it's important to understand that when we're cutting a mask ourselves, we're basically using a pair of scissors, so it only works on things that already have clear edges. But we said that it would be nearly impossible to put anything behind the foreground in this shot. Now that you know that the foreground can't be keyed, and we can only paint a matte if the edges are definable, you can see that this shot would be a complete nightmare to work on, and it would never end up looking really good. It seems so simple, but it's the norm for even highly paid VFX people to go blank about matting on the set. So we really have to hammer in these points. Another typical thing to do in Photoshop is to paint things out. If we, for example, need to remove these tracking markers on her face, we can use a clone tool to copy a piece of skin from somewhere else. These are just examples, and it's easy to imagine a million ways we could use Photoshop to change pictures or paint things in or out. But one of the most wrong assumptions people make is that just because it's easy to Photoshop something on a still, it's easy to do the same on moving pictures. Moving pictures are a whole other ballgame because suddenly everything we do has to move around the exact same way. If we, for example, decided that this person needs a tattoo on her forehead, we can do that in Photoshop in 30 seconds. But as soon as she moves around, the tattoo has to move and warp the same way as her face, or we break the illusion that she actually has a tattoo. Also, composites have to look good, playing at 24 frames per second. And that means that there are many things you'd quickly do on a still picture in Photoshop that don't work on moving pictures. If we, for example, wanted to put anything behind this girl, we would have to hand paint or airbrush a matte because there are no even colors to key from. It's pretty hard because of the fine hair detail. But if we put in some time, we might actually tolerate it. But that's just a still image. On moving pictures, we then have to paint the same thing for 24 frames per second. And when you play that back at full speed, the edge is boiling. And you realize how impossible it is to paint the same way twice. That's why you can't expect to be able to Photoshop moving pictures the same way you'd Photoshop a still. On moving pictures, we have to be able to repeat it. For that reason, compositors have to use a different set of tools. Bunch of layers that work exactly like Photoshop. Each layer has its own matte, and then the layers are just stacked on top of each other. Each layer can be processed individually, so we can, for example, take a layer, add a keyer, color correct it, add some film grain or whatever. And all of these changes happen only to the graphics on that layer. So this is called layer-based compositing. But while that's fine for simple stuff, the moment we get into feature-level compositing, there are too many things you can't do. For example, if we want to make a cloudy glow behind all of the bottles, what we'd really like to do is steal the matte from each of the bottles. Combine them into a single matte we can use to control the glow. Then we expand the size of the matte, blur it, bring in a cloud pattern, use the combined matte to mask the pattern, and then put the whole thing back into the composite behind the bottles. Looking like this. You can see the cloudy glow behind all the bottles. We'd actually have to scratch our heads to figure out how to do that in layer-based compositing, and it would no doubt be some crazy workaround. But this is everyday stuff you have to be able to do. So high-end compositing uses a different philosophy called node-based compositing, where instead of just imagining a flowchart, we literally build one right on the screen. If you've ever sat in on a professional composite, these are the kinds of diagrams you've been looking at. People sometimes find these flowcharts intimidating, but they're actually very simple, and anyone can understand them. Everything is done with nodes, which are little modules that do something. A node might be a loader node that brings in footage. Then we might run it through a color corrector node, which gives you options for how to tweak the colors. A film grain node that simulates film grain. A glow node that glows an image. Or one of hundreds of other tools that do some small task. You then build chains where you run the footage through one node after another to tweak and do stuff to it. And chains are then composited on top of each other with a merge node that has two inputs. This is a lot like how you would draw a factory assembly line. And this kind of compositing gives artists a whole new level of freedom because it allows you to build a composite the same way you think it mentally. Until a few years ago, node-based compositing was done on systems called Flame and Inferno from Autodesk. These systems cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they've been used on many blockbusters you know. But it's just software, and you can do the same on a high-end PC. So in this course, we're using Fusion from Ion Software, which is used on many blockbusters and which is our favorite. Other tools are Shake on a Mac and Nuke, and they're all very decent tools. So on the next many volumes, you'll see many screenshots that have nodes. But it's not until the last volume that we'll explain what they do. And then we'll end up by analyzing every major composite we've done. But let's do a very basic composite in Fusion so you get some idea. Just keep in mind that this course is not software training, and we only show software if it helps explain a concept. We'll start by importing some footage, so we'll put in a loader node with a clip of a mountain scene. If we don't like the color tint, we might run it through a color corrector. So we'll connect the output of the loader to the input of the color corrector. Now let's say that we want to put a green screen character on top. So we make a new loader to bring in a doll shot on a green screen. And to make a matte from the green areas, we run it through a keyer, which we've already configured to save time. These two chains end up in thin air right now. So to put them together, we create what's called a merge node, which has two inputs, one for background and one for foreground. We then simply connect the output of the background chain to the background input, and the output of the foreground chain to the foreground input. And then we create a saver node to write the final output back to disk. That's a composite. So you might be asking if we couldn't just have done that in After Effects. And you're right, as long as it's that simple. But the moment we want to get creative and maybe steal the matte from the keyer and use that to do something else, or whatever, suddenly this flowchart approach is 1,000,000 times better than layer-based compositing. Finally, when you're working on a composite, you're not limited to just watching the final output, but instead have a monitor that you can use to go in on each stage and check up on the assembly line. That means that the output on the client monitor might seem to change a lot. But all we're really doing is looking at the output from the selected node. So you shouldn't let that intimidate you either. Where's the matte going to come from? If you can't answer that question on the set, you could be in for it in post. Because what's important to understand is that if you can't pull a matte using one of the techniques we're covering, you probably can't pull a matte at all. And that would be bad. So let's go over one more time why you need a matte. You first of all need a matte to extract anything. You also need a matte if you want to process anything, like color correct it. And you need a matte if you want to put anything behind anything. But first, some good news, which is that 3D always comes with a built-in matte. So you never need to worry about mattes for 3D. We're only talking about pulling mattes from live action. And we can either do that automatically using a keyer, or manually by painting it by hand. Starting with keyers, you simply put an actor in front of a green screen. Tell the keyer that we're using the color green as a key, and then we can lift the character out and put her into something else. This is called color keying or chroma keying, which mean the same thing to key based on a color. In an ideal world, that's all there is to it. But there's a vast difference between a good key and a bad key. And we'll talk a lot about this on Volume 5 and 6, but let's cover a few basics now. Color keyers work by isolating a color range, and the smaller the range, the better. In this shot, there's actually a difference of many exposure stops between left and right. What that does to your key is that it ruins your edges. And to explain that, let's look at the doll's hair. We know that the green screen is green out here, and that the hair is white or light brown. But if you look at the fine hair here, it's actually too thin to fill out a pixel all the way. Instead, the pixels are half brown and half green, which is called a subpixel. The problem is that when the background color is not even, we have to start defining a bigger and bigger color range as green, which causes us to eat more and more into the subpixels. That's very bad because we end up shaving off all the fine detail, giving everybody a haircut. This overcutting of the edges is the hallmark of bad green screen. And by the same token, good edges and fine detail is the hallmark of green screen done right. So for color keying, the number one goal is as clear and distinct a color as possible. Now what's really interesting is that you can actually use any color you want. It doesn't have to be green. So if we want to color correct this person's clothes, all we have to do is key it. Again, we highlight everything that has the color we want, which defines the color range. And then the software cuts a matte for us. This is what we mean with automatic matting, because the matte perfectly fits her contour and animates automatically. And we didn't have to do anything but set up the keyer. Of course, it also selects the house in the background, but we could exclude that with a manual matte. To do the color correction, we then simply use the keyer to drive a color corrector. Then we tint towards blue, or whatever else. And all this is isolated to a few specific areas. Let's do another keyer to pick up the pink areas, and let's make them more orange just to do something. And actually, let's grab all the greenery in the background. Make a matte. Drive a color corrector with it, tweak some colors. And here's our shot, which is very different from before. And just to remember, here's the before shot. And after again. This is a terrific way to do color correction, and it's especially powerful for commercials because you get very specific control. But the main point is that we can use a color keyer to pull a matte from anything that has a clear color. However, sometimes color is not what defines the area we want to work on, and that brings us to the luminance keyer, which keys on a brightness range. In this shot, the sky is completely burned out, and there are obviously no colors to grab because it's all white. But this time we select the range of brightness we want, which produces a matte we can use to replace the sky. Of course, we're selecting a lot of other areas that have the same brightness, meaning that we'll have sky showing in the bottom of the shot too, so the matte still needs some paintwork. But this basically gets the job done. This is actually a solution to a shooting problem you have every day, because now you know that it's relatively doable to fix an overcast or burned out sky. The thing to look out for is that the rest of the scene is lit in a way that's consistent with the new sky, or it might not make sense lighting-wise. It doesn't make sense with a hazy, retreating foreground, and then suddenly a clear blue sky behind it. Obviously, the sky needs to be made to look like it's behind the haze too. But it still looks a lot better. Also, some things make it harder to grab a key, for example, a visible cloud cover. Because there are so many shades in the sky that we can't grab it without also grabbing everything else. No keyer would fix this. We'd have to paint a matte. An out-of-focus background also makes it hard to get hold of the edges. Instead, you tend to get these halo edges when the keyer stops keying halfway through the grade between light and dark. Another kind of keyer is called a difference keyer, which can supposedly generate a key from the difference between two shots. So that if you have a shot with a person and the same shot without the person, it should make a key from that. But in reality, it simply gives you the pixel value difference between two shots. And if both the foreground and the background are bright, there's no difference. And the key is instead full of holes and not useful without hardcore tweaking, which ruins it at the same time. So you should never count on being able to difference key because it almost never works. Finally, it's possible to shoot a silhouette pass and use it as a matte. You can only do this on static objects shot with locked cameras or motion control. Then you first shoot a beauty pass, which can be on any background. And then you backlight it and shoot it again. This pass can be converted into a matte. And then we can cut out the figure very effectively. This is used a lot on car commercials, but it only works in a very controlled environment. Now, believe it or not, as far as automatic matting goes, these are the only tools the compositor has. If you can't pull a matte using either color, brightness, difference, or silhouette, you basically can't pull a matte at all. This often comes as a surprise to directors and DPs, but there are no magic buttons. If, for example, we had the idea that this pine tree should glow pink, there's absolutely nothing that distinguishes that tree from the others and nothing for a keyer to grab. Painting a matte would be a monumental task. And if the camera were also moving, it would probably be impossible. So it's really that important to think about where the matte is going to come from. here to get his matte, because the colors in his clothes are the same as everything else. The only way to get the spaceship behind him is to paint his matte by hand. But we can't just take the shot into Photoshop and paint the mask with an airbrush, because it's impossible to paint the same way for hundreds of frames. So in compositing, we have a different tool that's easier to animate, which is called a garbage matte. A garbage matte is a spline made by stringing together control points. We can move the points, and we can work on the bend to tweak the outline. A garbage matte can also have a hard edge, or a soft edge if that fits better. But what's important here is that to animate the outline, all we have to do is animate the 5 or 10 control points, which is a lot more predictable than trying to redo 1,000 brush strokes for every frame. It's this simplicity that's both the good part and bad part of garbage matting. As the name implies, garbage matting was invented to remove unwanted junk from mats that had already been keyed, like this equipment around the actor. With a garbage matte, we simply surround those parts and they disappear, giving us a clean composite. So it's fine to have stuff get very near the actor, as long as it doesn't touch the edges. By the same token, if we had something green on the body, that would punch a hole in the matte. A garbage matte can patch up the hole as long as it doesn't get too close to the edge. Finally, in the last chapter, where the Luma key of the sky also keyed some stuff on the ground, we could easily use a garbage matte to patch up the matte, so we're only keying the sky. So that's where they came from, but they've since evolved into a sort of all-purpose way to paint mattes. One of the very typical uses is to control where an effect is applied. For example, to limit a glow effect to this actor's eyes. Obviously, the first task is to surround his eyes with a spline. And then we have this compositing concoction that doesn't really need an explanation, except that it makes glow where the matte is. Now, the garbage matte needs to move like the character moves. So you typically start on a middle frame that's representative of the shot. And when you like the shape, you move 10 frames ahead. Here it no longer fits, so you tweak it, which creates a new keyframe. When we scrub through these 10 frames, the computer has in between the animation. But in the middle at frame 155, the alignment is a little off, so we'll adjust the matte here too. You do this for the entire animation, working in steps of maybe 10 or 20 frames, and then subdividing to refine it. That gives us a matte that outlines his eyes from start to finish, and this is an extremely typical use for a garbage matte. Many people call the process rotoscoping, but regardless of the name, we're just animating a matte. As we've now watched it a few times, we haven't actually done a good enough job following his motion, so the animation needs more work. Another very typical thing to do with a garbage matte is to mask out foreground. And if you remember this shot from before, our next step was to mask the spaceship behind him. Again, we pick a frame that's representative of his shape, and then we trace his outline. We're trying to use enough control points that we capture his outline, but not so many that it becomes hard to animate. So we end up with 20 or 30 control points. And later we'll make a separate mat for the space between his legs. We're only trying to be accurate where the spaceship will actually be behind him. Next we move the play cursor 10 frames ahead. And already the outline doesn't match. So we adjust it again, and you can see that this is incredibly tedious work. Before you know it, we've spent half a day on a 5-second mat. That's why matting is a constant but invisible drain on your budget, and anything you can do to make it easier will help. Next we back it up 5 frames, and make an in-between keyframe, and so on. We'll have to go through this workflow another 100 or 200 times. But here's the final shot, and it almost works. But the mat is sort of bobbing around his edge in the last part of the shot. Actually, the bobbing is always there, but it's most visible on slow-moving objects. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that garbage mats look better on things that move fast. But garbage mats are really not a good way to find edges. And you should use a green screen whenever you possibly can. If you know that something is going to go behind this girl, roll in a portable green screen for her shot. Then get a clean pass of the background. And since the lighting is the same, she'll keep perfectly with all the detail intact. The same way, always do green or blue screen outside of windows if you don't have a real exterior or a backdrop. The keyer grabs the outline just like that. Both these shots would be a garbage matting nightmare, and you save a fantastic amount of time in post by using green screens liberally. If the foreground is a simple static object, it's much easier because all we have to do is paint a mat for a single frame. And then it almost doesn't matter how complicated it is. It's even okay to airbrush a mat in Photoshop because we only have to paint it for one frame. But this technique doesn't work if there's camera movement because then we'd have to animate the mat. Only pan tilt is still easy because it's the same outline, it just moves around the frame. Then we can use a tracker to match the movement, which we'll start talking about in a few chapters. But we still couldn't solve this shot because the branches move and they're semi-transparent. We'd probably have to do a dozen garbage mats with soft edges and hope for the best. But ideally, we'd have shot it without the branches and done them in post, probably as a green screen element. The only kind of semi-transparent foreground that really works properly with garbage mats is clear-cut transparency, like the windows of a car. Then we simply paint a mat inside the windows to cancel the first mat. And then the windows are 50% see-through. As long as the edges are defined, this is not all that hard. But all in all, matting is so important that you're never off the hook and you have to think about it all the time. But you should also consider avoiding problems simply by how you frame shots. Here it would have been much easier and completely legitimate to simply have him stop over here. And then we don't need a mat at all. And even if a hand or a shoulder accidentally goes over the spaceship, then we only have to deal with that. Just don't use garbage matting as a substitute for keying because it is, after all, only a cardboard cutout. So we see either that element or the background. But with more subtle effects like smoke or light, we'd actually rather blend them on top so they mix with the target image. If we tried to luma key it, there'd be too much of a clear threshold where the background stops and the foreground starts, which doesn't look as good. The first option is, of course, to add one plate to another, which is the same as a double exposure. The problem is that simply adding elements almost always results in overexposure. Because adding, for example, 75% white to 50% white produces 125% white, which is too much. So instead, people use a method called screen, which is a favorite in VFX production. It works by multiplying negative versions of the images together. And while that can seem hard to understand, the end result is an image that's never darker and never overexposes either. Screening is used all the time. In the dinosaur scene, you see some smoke around the dinosaur's feet. This is a 3D particle element which is just white on black. It doesn't have a matte, but when we screen it on top, it just sort of blends. For monitors, you get the best result by shooting them black, and then screening graphics on top instead of just replacing them, so you get to keep the reflections. And the same with this picture frame. But these things are also tracking issues, which we'll start talking about in the next chapter. So if an element needs to be semi-transparent in the final composite, people often prefer to shoot them on a black background because keying would make the edges too solid. But the downside to screening is that it sometimes looks too transparent, and especially an explosion doesn't seem to have enough body to it. The solution is to first use a luma keyer to get a brightness matte of the explosion, and then use that matte to darken the background around the center of the explosion. When we screen the raw explosion back on top, we get the same soft edges, but it's more solid in the middle because we cut a hole for it. But all that being said, keyers are so good these days that if you have a really good green screen, you can get very healthy results with a keyer. And we'd probably prefer to shoot all but very thin elements on a green screen. The final blend mode we're interested in is called multiply, which does the same as screening, only the image becomes darker. You need this if you, for example, have a shadow pass, which is usually rendered on a white background. To get the shadow into the target shot, we multiply it. Anything that was white stays the same, and anything that was black is darkened. There are many other blend modes, but truth be told, even most compositors don't know what they do. Sometimes you end up using them by accident, but we're mostly interested in screening and multiplying. But the moment the picture is moving, anything we put on top has to move and twist the exact same way. However, that's nearly impossible to do by hand. Because if we don't match the motion 100.0%, the illusion falls apart. That's why the tracker was invented. A tracker is a tool that's able to lock onto a feature and then follow it anywhere it moves. Afterwards, it is recorded down to the millimeter exactly where the feature moved. This tracking data can be used for all kinds of things. First of all, to attach the smiley to the tracker. Then we'll maybe offset it to get it to the center. And now it's completely locked to the paper. And suddenly it does actually seem like it's on the paper. So to do a more real example of 2D tracking, here's a car that we want to shoot full of bullet holes. You can buy bullet holes as graphics, like this one from the ArtBeats Gunstock library. First, we track a high contrast feature near where the bullet hole is supposed to appear. Then we bring in the graphic, size it, attach it to the tracker, offset it, and that's all there is to making one bullet hole. Then we've done that 6 more times and added some sound. So that's very effective. And this is probably the most typical use for tracking. The only problem is that it doesn't really take perspective into account. Because even if the car is shot from an angle, the bullet hole is still seen from the front. It's possible to rotate the graphic around itself, but we ultimately don't escape the fact that it's a flat graphic, so we can only do it so much. We would also have to match the perspective manually, like we did here. To truly track perspective, you use a tool called a corner pinner, which has 4 corners with the graphic stretched out between them. Then all we have to do is track 4 corners of a poster we want to replace. And then here's the replacement. But the key thing about tracking is that there has to be something to track. So you can't simply feed it a blank wall and hope to attach a poster. If there's nothing to track, we have to put something in, like the 4 squares here. Then we can attach a new graphic. But since we're screening the new graphic on top to keep the reflections, the markers stay, so they have to be painted out. Another very typical use for tracking is to make garbage matting easier. The biggest problem in garbage matting is actually to match the overall motion of the person. But the outline itself doesn't really change that much. By tracking the garbage mat to a feature on the person, it's much easier because now all we have to do is animate the change in shape. And that's quite a lot simpler. All the big stuff is already taken care of, and the rest is animated in just a few extra keyframes. Another thing that's typical to do with tracking is to stabilize footage. Again, you simply track a feature, or actually 2 to stabilize the rotation. And then the software uses the inverted tracking data to move the plate in the opposite direction of the tracker. The end result is an extremely steady shot. Of course, it also ends up off-center, so it has to be offset back. But even then, the process causes occasional black edges, so it's necessary to zoom in about 20%, which costs a little bit of quality. These are just some examples, but tracking is actually part of almost everything in visual effects. Most importantly, tools like planar tracking, or motion capture, or match moving, which we'll spend a great deal of time talking about later. But in order to understand the possibilities and problems we'll encounter then, we first need to learn exactly how a regular old-fashioned 2D tracker works. And we need a basic education in how they work. A tracker has two components. First, a search pattern, which is the small box, and a search area, which is the big box. The search pattern is the feature the software is supposed to look for, and the search area is how far away the software is allowed to look. Under ideal conditions, you just run the tracker, and it tracks the feature around the screen. Then you can attach things to or near the tracker. But trackers are very picky about what's a good pattern to search for. Trackers first of all need good contrast. You can't simply tell it to track a white piece of paper, because there's nothing that makes one part of the paper look different from another, and the tracker jumps around. A human couldn't follow a point on the paper either. The absolute favorite feature for a tracker is a corner, because it makes it very clear what we're tracking. Dots are also excellent for tracking, and lots of effects are actually done by painting dots on people or things, using them to track on an effect, and then painting out the dots. But anything that has a distinct pattern and contrast can be tracked. We even stay locked on this dog's nose for most of the shot. So that's very good. But believe it or not, that's actually the last good news in this chapter, and it's all problems from now on. You, for example, can't track any point on a line because there's nothing that really distinguishes one part from another. The tracker is sliding all over because everything looks the same. You also can't track points on edges because part of what defines the feature is the background. And backgrounds can change. The moment the background changes away from sky, the search pattern no longer exists and the tracker fails. But this kind of stuff is really just the tracking guy's problem, because if a feature is bad to track, he should just track something better. So let's talk about some problems that come directly from how we're shooting. The absolute number one enemy of tracking is when features get blocked by something in the foreground, which is called occlusion. That means that if we're tracking something, and anything passes through the foreground, the track is destroyed. The tracking guy will then have to try to guess what the feature would be doing behind the foreground, which is hard. And you can imagine what happens to a corner pin if one of the trackers is blocked. The moment the foreground moves over the corner we're tracking, the whole thing falls apart. A tracker will sometimes let you track through subtle foreground. Here we're actually pretty lucky. But it's hard to know where the threshold for too much foreground is. And it's just as big a problem to paint a matte for it anyway. Down the same alley, it's obviously no good if a feature leaves the frame. Again, if we do a corner pin, the shot falls apart if any of the corners leave the frame. In this case, the compositor has to try to guess what the missing corners are doing outside the frame, which is nearly impossible. All this puts so many constraints on your shooting that you really start hating tracking and corner pinning. There are also some less obvious consequences of our shooting that can ruin a tracker, which are that features can't change appearance. And that happens, for example, when things become bigger or smaller in the frame. Here we're tracking the headlights of a bus. But when they become big, they no longer look like they did in the beginning, and the tracker fails. The headlight is really a kind of dot. And what's happening is that in the first part of the move, the dot looks like a dot. But as it gets bigger, it's no longer a dot, but part of a round edge, and the tracker fails. The solution is that the compositor starts in the middle and tracks both forwards and then backwards, so the same search pattern will work throughout. But suddenly it gets very complicated because you might have to restart a tracker many times to keep it tracking. Let's use this track to put on an anamorphic lens flare, which looks sort of expensive. But this is why corners work so well. No matter how much you zoom in on a corner, it's still a corner. Another thing that can cause a feature to suddenly look differently is if we're really tracking a reflection or a glint. Here we have what looks like an excellent feature. But when the angle changes, the glint moves and doesn't produce any helpful tracking. Unless, of course, we're trying to track the glint. Yet another thing that will make a feature look different to a tracker is if it rotates. And this comes as news even to many people who know tracking. But from a tracker's perspective, a feature has officially become something else when it is rotated about 30 degrees and the tracker will fail. Finally, camera settings like depth of field and shutter speed have a lot to say. Here we're tracking something done with a fast shutter, and it's easy because every frame is crisp. But with the shutter at 1/30th of a second, the moment we pan, the features wash out, and in the computer's mind they're gone. And the same goes for focus blur. If a feature is out of focus, it can't be tracked. And if all these problems weren't enough, the noise in the film or the video itself also disturbs the tracker. This is called jitter, where the tracker tends to jump around plus minus a pixel. That means that whatever you attach to the tracker also jitters. So all of this begs the question, why would anybody want to mess with tracking at all? Well, the thing is that until just a few years ago, you simply had to. If you wanted to replace a graphic, you simply had to find a way to track 4 corners and drive a corner pinner. And if a feature disappeared behind an object, you'd have to fake its motion while it was gone. But due to one particular invention, times have changed, and so everything we've been showing you is in a sense how it used to be done. Corners, which is what we were struggling to do in the last chapter. Instead, it tracks planes, meaning that it actually understands which part is the phone and which part is the background, much like our own eyes do. And then it's extremely easy for it to insert a graphic on the phone, even if there are no obvious corners to track and reflections everywhere. Planar tracking works on 2 principles that it helps to understand. The first is that instead of just tracking single points, the software tracks anything that looks like a feature. On a regular shot, the software might be tracking 100 or 200 or even 1,000 features. Secondly, and this is the interesting part, if we look at the motion of each of these features, you can see that the ones on the phone move differently from the ones in the background. That's how the computer understands that the phone is a different plane than the background. The thing is that if we now put in a virtual corner pin box for the insert, it's actually resting comfortably on hundreds or thousands of trackers, not just 4 corners that can break at any time. So the insert is perfectly glued to the plane, even as it twists and turns. It doesn't matter if trackers get blocked, and it doesn't even matter if they leave the screen. In fact, since we don't depend on any single tracker, we can ruin up to 90% of them. And the planar tracker will still keep a perfect lock on the phone. So this completely changes the rules for tracking, not just for the tracking guy, but for how we shoot it. Because it means that we're suddenly allowed to shoot without thinking that much about tracking, which would have been deadly before. For that reason, we've decided to forget about old-school tracking in this course and only talk about how to shoot for planar tracking, because that's all that really matters. Planar tracking was pioneered by a company called Imagineer Systems. And these couple of chapters depend on you having access to 3 products. First, Monet for replacement, Motor for rotoscoping, and Moki for painting things out. Before you shoot, you should check with your compositors that they can do planar tracking. In this chapter, we'll just do a quick tour of planar tracking, and then in the next chapter, we'll create some on-set instructions to follow. The thing that's important to understand about planar tracking is that we're no longer looking for points or corners to track. Instead, planar tracking tracks texture, which means all the detail that's on the plane itself. As long as there's enough detail on the plane that you can track it with your own eyes, chances are the software can too, which is almost always the case. Then the compositor simply surrounds the plane with a spline to tell the software what we're working on. Then he puts in a virtual corner pin box that will rest on the plane. And then runs the tracker. Afterwards, we have a box that moves perfectly with the plane, even as 2/3 of it disappears off screen. It's literally that simple. So let's put in the Mona Lisa. And this is where the magic happens. Because it keeps tracking even as 2/3 of it disappears off screen. This would have been essentially hopeless to do with a 2D tracker. So suddenly, almost everything is an easy track because we don't need to see the entire plane to track it. And it doesn't even matter if people step in front. But it also means that many of the things people have learned about tracking, like putting in markers to track a screen, are now wrong. So in the next chapter, we'll create a new set of rules for exactly what to do on the set. Matting work also improves dramatically with planar tracking. Normally, you'd have to rotoscope the shape by setting lots of keyframes. And often it still doesn't turn out that great. With planar tracking, you just track the surface. Then you take your time to draw a single very detailed mat using all the control points you want. And when we play it, this is again remarkable. The spline sticks to the plane like Velcro, and we didn't have to animate a single keyframe. If this mat had been done by hand, it would have been bobbing at least a little bit. So planar tracking results in much higher quality mats. Finally, another thing that planar tracking does exceptionally well is object removal, which is an important task because it lets you leave support rigs actually in the frame when you're shooting. We'll talk a lot about it later, so let's not waste time here. But for a quick demo, here's a shot that's perfect, except for the marker stand sticking up from the bottom. But with a little work in the software called Moki, remarkably the stands vanish. So that's something of a magic trick. We'll show you exactly how it's done on Volume 4. Because we're assuming you'll just refer to it right before a shoot. One of the main paradigm shifts is that you no longer have to put in tracking markers, because planar tracking doesn't track points. It tracks texture. We can track anything that has some kind of pattern to it. But we can't track things with absolutely no pattern, and those times we have to help out. In this chapter, it's important to distinguish between a tracking problem and a compositing problem, because almost everything is an easy track. So it's really the composite you have to think about when you're shooting. There are two ways to composite, either to replace what's there with something completely new, or to combine the new element with the plate and to keep the original reflections or texture. Starting with a straight replace, a typical example would be a license plate, which is as simple as tracking it, then we can paint a new license plate in Photoshop, and then insert it back, completely replacing the original license plate. Unless there's foreground passing through the shot, this is extremely easy. If we're replacing something that isn't rectangular, like a logo, it helps to have some clean pictures of the entire surface. So after the shot, it's good to get the surface from a clean angle, because then we can make a clean background in Photoshop, put in the new logo, and then track the whole thing back in. This way, the background keeps its natural texture. If we just dropped in a graphic, it would replace the entire surface and wouldn't look real. The element we're tracking is allowed to leave the frame, as we saw in the last chapter. So all the problems with 2D tracking are really gone, and it's important not to shoot with that in mind, because you'll just make things worse if you start putting in markers. The element is also allowed to be partially blocked. The planar tracker really doesn't need to see a lot of the plane to track it, so we're fine to have an actor walk in front. We're also using planar tracking to pull a mat of the actor, so these kinds of shots sometimes make themselves. But there is a danger here, because as we've said many times, you can't count on matting through complicated foreground. All it takes is one actor with frizzy hair to make this a nearly impossible composite. We're actually not doing too good in our shot either. If you compare it to what she looked like before, all the fine hair detail is gone. So we strongly recommend that if you have the chance, that you make any element keyable by painting it green or blue. Then it doesn't matter if anyone steps in front. We'll get a perfect mat every time. Another huge plus to making elements green is that we'll have a much easier time finding the element's own outline. This prop, for example, wouldn't just need tracking to insert an image. It would need major roto work to find the edge. But a green element finds its own edge. So these are two really good reasons to use green elements as much as possible. But there is a downside to green elements, that they have zero texture, which can be a tracking problem. It's not a problem when you can see the whole thing, like in the cloud shot, because then the shape of the element is a texture in itself. We can even track something else on the same plane. So here we're tracking the gravel in the upper left. But the insert is over on the green cloud. As long as they're on the same plane, we can use one to track the other. The problem is that if the surroundings have no texture, like this green poster on a wall, or are not on the same plane, like this green element out in the open, or we push into or pull out from the element completely so there's no clue where we are, there's just no way to track it. And in those situations, we do have to put in tracking markers. Then we pull out. And then this is the easiest track in the world. Without the markers, it would have been one of the hardest. The same goes for all shots that have no built-in texture. If we wanted to place a note on the refrigerator, this track would fall apart right about here. And we'd actually have a real problem. So again, we can place some tape squares. But really, anything will do. Then here's the note. And then it's super easy to track it in. Since the markers fit nicely behind the note, they didn't have to be painted out. The second kind of compositing is to combine the new element into the shot instead of just all-out replacing it. To keep the glare or any natural texture, which always looks better. Especially monitors that are near the camera should always be tracked in post because it's hard to make them look really good live. There are two choices for backing color, either black, and then you double expose or screen the graphic on top and the glare stays. Or green or blue, and then you key it in. Contrary to popular belief, modern keyers have absolutely no problem keying through reflections. And we'll talk about this much more on the green screen volumes. The clear advantage to green is that we can see exactly what we're tracking. And anything that steps in front will get an automatic matte. So you should use green or blue when you can. The downside is that as soon as you have green elements, the cinematography has to be about that. And you can't adjust the exposure on the green element without changing everything else, which can be a deal breaker for green. This one would probably work. But other times the green will come out murky and unkeyable. And in those cases, you're better off just putting something black behind the glass and screening the graphics on top. But then also be aware that anything that moves in front has to be rotoed by hand. Now, great as these reflections are, there's a constant danger of tracking the reflections instead of the surface. The extreme is a mirror. But if you ever have reflections that could overpower the surface itself, or even worse, a surface that's only reflections, you have to put in tracking markers. 4 or 5 distinct squares is enough to define some texture. Unfortunately, the markers will also end up in the composite, so they have to be painted out. But this lets us track it. Actually, we can also creatively rearrange the stuff on the table to get it on the same plane, and track those things instead. Again, as long as they're on the same plane, they tell the computer just as much about how the insert should be moving. So now we've done the same thing without markers. But don't panic about reflections, because everyday reflections aren't overpowering, and we were perfectly able to track the phone. Just be careful if they're stronger than that. Now, there's an important thing to know about planar tracking, that new elements will be placed on the plane we're tracking. For the outside of a window, that means that the entire skyline will move as if it's a poster hanging 4 feet outside the window, which is very unrealistic. To use planar tracking for this, there's only one solution, which is to put the green screen as far back as possible and make it huge. But that's not really necessary. Later we'll talk about a more advanced kind of tracking called match moving that lets us work in real 3D, and that's the better way to do it. Until then, there's also an old 2D trick to placing outsides of windows, which is to track a marker in regular 2D, and then simply pin the skyline to it. In the real world, a skyline has basically zero parallax change, so we only need to match pan tilt and camera wobble, which we can do by tracking a single point, or 2 if there's any rotation. So the rule of thumb is always place 2 tracking markers on a green screen outside a window. Place them on what will be the horizon in the final shot, then it tracks better. It's also worth noting that if there's no camera movement besides pan tilt, then planar tracking is total overkill, because all we have to do is track a single point near the insert, pin the new element to it, and then we can pan and tilt as much as we want. Finally, it's important to realize that planar tracking tracks flat planes, and that means that you can't track anything round or curvy. This needs to be tracked as a virtual prop, which is pretty high-tech, but we're not ready to talk about how that works yet. You also can't track things that change shape, like a flag or a t-shirt, and there's no simple way to do that with any technology. Changing the logo on this t-shirt would be incredibly difficult, unless it was pretty flat. And you need your clarity, so this is a good time to take a break. Now, to put elements together, they need to be shot from the same angle, or station point as we call it. The station point changes the perspective rendering, so being very low or very high renders a different perspective than being level. Being close by also gives a different perspective than being far away, which has a flatter perspective. We're obviously changing the zoom between these two shots, but we're only doing it to get the far away shot bigger in the frame, because all we care about is the camera's position relative to the actor. So if you're shooting an element on green screen and this is the correct station point, it's okay to zoom in to use your entire resolution. The perspective rendering is the same, we're just Xeroxing it bigger to use the entire negative. The whole point then is that to composite elements together, the station points have to match in both shots. And some examples of doing it wrong are first of all to be high up in this shot, but putting her into a level shot. Or we might be level on her, but put her into a low shot. We also might be very close here, giving a warp perspective, but be very far away here, so they again don't match. Matching station points is primarily about matching the height, because it quickly shows if you're off. Onset compositing can help get the angle right, but you're much better off if you simply make a habit of measuring the camera height for every shot you ever do. You simply write it on a piece of paper and roll 2 seconds of film. Then it's easy to shoot other plates from the same height. If we're doing scaling, like if we want to put her on this table, we first shoot the element and note the camera height. Then we simply divide it by 10 and shoot the table at 8.7 inches. So they match without problem. The tilt doesn't matter as much between the shots because it doesn't change the perspective rendering, so it just has to be in the ballpark. Matching the distance to the subject is also important, especially when we're close, because the perspective is so pronounced. When we get 20 or 30 feet back, there's really no point in going further back because it wouldn't look much different. So if you're shooting a green screen element that will be placed on a mountaintop, you don't actually have to be a mile away. 20 feet will do it. If we want to put 3D into a scene, we also have to match the 3D camera to the live action camera. This is done so that the 3D objects will have the same perspective rendering as the live action, and also to help 3D interact with the live action. For example, if this stick needs to cast a shadow, we can then build a 3D ground that matches the live action ground. And then we can cast shadows that bend the same way and in the right places. On a lock shot, you typically just eyeball the 3D camera by loading up the shot as a background in the 3D software. And then the goal is to see if we can fudge a camera position and focal length that makes the grid line up. This is difficult but not impossible. But everything in this chapter so far has assumed a lock camera. If there's any camera movement in a plate, we have to somehow copy that exact camera move in the other plate. We don't really consider pan tilt to be an actual camera movement because the perspective doesn't change enough to matter. So to put in this car, all we have to do is eyeball a good angle in 3D. Then in Fusion, we 2D track a feature. And when we attach the car to the tracker, we have for all intents and purposes copied the camera move. You could actually create an entire matte painting in Photoshop as an overlay and just track it in. Another way is to shoot an oversized background plate at a very high resolution. Then we can do all our paint work or insert 3D graphics. And then we can simply scan through the image, which is the same as a nodal pan. But an actual physically moving camera is a totally different ballgame because the movement in one plate has to be matched in the other. If both plates are live action, there's only one way, which is motion control. Then we program a single camera move once and repeat it on several locations. But if we have a live action plate and we want to put 3D into it, we have to somehow copy the live action camera move in 3D. But that's actually not so simple. If we, for example, wanted to put this car into the parking lot, we could first of all try to use a 2D tracker. Then we track a rock in the middle, and then attach the car. But it's very obvious that the car's angle isn't changing, so this doesn't work. We have to match the actual perspective change. So as a second attempt, let's instead load up the clip as a background in 3D. And then let's try to match the camera move by adjusting the 3D camera and setting keyframes. Looking just at the car, it seems like it could work. But when we composite it, we're not even close. Suddenly, it's painfully clear that a real camera move is far too complex to be copied by hand, and the car is skidding and sliding all over the place. We haven't tried very hard, but the thing is that it doesn't matter if we spent a month on it, it will never work. There's just too much detail we're not aware of. But there is a technology that can solve this, which is called match moving. Match moving is able to read a shot and extract the exact camera move in 3D. Then anything we create in 3D can be shot the exact same way. And when we put them together, it's a little bit like magic, because the 3D looks like it's really standing there. This is such an important technology that it's part of almost everything we're talking about from now on.